Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to our final open source training session for 2023. I'm not sure if you've joined us for what we've run for the past year, but this will be our 7th and closeout session for tonight. So really privileged to be hosting you for our last time this year on a topic that is very close to, I think, most of you at the forefront if you are in a leadership role. And tonight we'll be talking about how to manage and lead multi-generational teams. But before I tell you what it is that we'll be covering this evening, just a bit of a recap in case you've missed what we've done so far this year. And I just would like to, in the chat, pop for you our link to our website so you can go and have a look. And we've really had a golden thread throughout this year focusing on a business and organization's most important asset, its human capital. And we kicked off our session in, I think, about May, where we covered insights around building a learning strategy. So that was really for our learning and development professionals, human capital professionals, to look at very holistically and strategically, how do you go about building learning pathways? And from there, we bridged into looking at the very critical role human resources play in businesses and how do we leverage human resource as a business partner with a very clear focus, obviously, on the preceding session, which was around learning and development. And as we all know, many organizations are now building their own learning and development teams within the organization, which brought us to session 3, which one of my colleagues, the head of operations here at Omni, ran. And we then focused on, so how do you actually build a high-performance learning and development team? So should you have outsourced, and there'll always be a place for insourcing and partnering with other organizations, but quite critically, how do you build learning and development professionals within your organization? Thereafter, we looked at, so if you are doing that, what should organizations think about specifically as it relates to cybersecurity, educational technology, applications and tools? How do you make sure you protect your organization as well as your data and the employees that engage within that learning frameworks? And from there, after we did that, bit of a different shift back to focus on people. And last month, if you didn't have the opportunity to join us, we focused on the topic of psychological safety, which all of us know is a topic that is really hot at the moment, making sure protecting and creating an inclusive environment for our teams being very critical. And tonight we end off looking at how do we manage or lead multi-generational teams. So a couple of key elements that we'll be focusing on, and in no particular order, you'll see on your screen right now, is work styles and communication preferences. For the first time, organizations have about 4 different generations operating in one space at any given moment. And with that comes its unique challenges with regards to how we like to work and how we prefer to communicate. And then we'll link into building an inclusive culture. So acknowledging we do have different generations within our organization, but how do we create inclusivity, specifically when we also have different work modes that many businesses have adopted? So besides flex hours, we're looking at remote work, flexible work schedules, and even working with gig economy workers, dialing in from different time zones, very much like what we're experiencing this evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Again, another key focus on communication and how better to bridge the gap for conflict resolution, which is a natural state of being when we're dealing with various generations, but also just in the way we work, that will become either forming or storming opportunity for us to really, as leaders, look at how do we manage conflict and resolve that effectively. And then lastly, we'll focus on technology adoption. And again, without being biased around it, as in technology evolves, there is obviously always been, and it's not generational, individuals that are much more digitally savvy, digitally native, and easy to adopt and experiment with tech. And then you do have a bit of a change process that has to kick in when we talk about technology and systems that have changed. How do we actually embrace that? And again, linking back to inclusive cultures. So that's literally what we have planned for this evening for the next about 15 minutes or so. But to do things a little differently, because that's what we do here at Omni, is really asking you as our audience, please engage with us, because surely at this stage, you would have been very comfortable with knowing who we are, and feel free to pose any questions that you might be finding is challenging within your space. So without further ado, I'm just going to quickly get rid of these slides on my screen now. I mentioned that we started off our session with creating learning insights and a learning framework. And that session was spearheaded by our managing director, which we have the privilege of having at our disposal every day. She started open source training in May 2023. And how better than to have her close out our final session for 2023. Lize, if you're ready, this really, to be quite vulnerable and honest, was not planned, out of no cleverness out of our own. We've had a bit of challenges with regards to getting ourselves go live this evening, and one of our speakers that were unable to join. And here we are, having to be agile and adapt very quickly. So Lize made her way home very quickly to get ready for tonight. Lize, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Cass. Yeah, it is a privilege to be here, and it's also a privilege to see everything happen full circle. I just want to ask, maybe if the team can just take note that I think on the LinkedIn, the link is not there yet, so yeah, if we can just put it there. But but yeah, I think that sure, that the topic is quite an expansive topic, and it's a big conversation to be had. And I have been in, I suppose, a very privileged position for the past 2 years now, of where I've been able to engage people in settings like this, not dissimilar to this, locally as well as internationally, talking about, you know, what are some of the burning platforms or the hot topics that I suppose as business people we all are dealing with at the moment. And a multi-generational workforce is most definitely one of the hot topics. And I think it's just going to be more and more a actual thing that as leaders we would need to embrace, and we would need to understand previous management and leadership styles and the way we've done things in the past is not necessarily going to serve us for the future. And being okay with engaging with that level of change and adaptation from us from a leadership point of view becomes quite critical. And I think that's also where authenticity and being vulnerable in certain conversations, you know, is important, because we don't know what we don't know. You know, we can say we have all the answers, but being realistic is we don't. And we're also learning as we're going, especially when we look at some of the really major change curve elements that has taken place within the world of work over the past 3 to 4 years. And that's just been exponential, and it requires quite a lot of tiptoeing for us as leaders, and and just being open to learn. I think that's the key component. But I'm here. I made it. I don't know if I'm camera ready, but I'm here.
That's brilliant. Lize, I think before we get started, for the people in the room and online that doesn't know who you are, yes, do you maybe want to just give the audience a little bit of background? I can read your bio. It might not do you 100% justice, but just give us a bit of an idea to your background and all the various things you're involved in.
So once upon a time, I would also have been what was classified as youth. At the moment, I'm not classified as youth anymore. But in my youth, I started my working career in the financial services sector. And I will always say that working within that corporate space and within financial services has always served myself exceptionally well. It was really a major training ground. Also learned quite a lot of hard lessons, and also lessons as a young person, because I think for me, on reflection, when we look at multi-generational workforces, it's also looking at how we sometimes contextualize groups of people based on our own unconscious bias that we have. And if I reflect back on when I started my working career, I was placed in a box and assumed to be young, inexperienced, and not able to do something. And having those mindsets, or at the receiving end of those mindsets, helped me to learn certain things. So I think that was a great thing. And yeah, so I have had the privilege of working for 10 years in that sector. And then I'm morphed into, I think, what is my passion and my passion alignment, which is human capital and people development. And I have had the immense pressure and privilege of working with the Omni team for what would next year be 15 years. So yeah, so that's a little bit about me. It's great to have everybody online. And like Kaz said, please, it's really open for discussion. So make use of the chat and also enable your mic if you want to discuss and be part of the conversation.
Just on the protocol around mic enablement,
Yes.
If everybody can just potentially, if you do want to have anything to say, because nobody naturally has microphone access, just raise your hand. What we'll easily do is just to give you microphone and camera access, and then you can ask us any questions to the people joining us on LinkedIn. I'll be monitoring the chat as well, so kind of multitasking. So I'm really not paying attention. I'm just trying to make sure we manage all the moving parts. If that's okay with everyone. We might, to some of the Omnians that have run sessions, like I see online, Cindy, Roshni, Simone, those guys, you guys naturally are able to join. So you might want to just pop in and join the conversation. Lize said we can kick off. So I did give the audience a bit of a background around what we wanted to chat about. But obviously no particular order, because I think it will be great to just have an organic conversation around the topic tonight. So I'm going to start off with the contentious one, which is the sort of post, let's go pre-COVID, we all went home and we had to do 100% remote work. And then we could start transitioning back. And then there was this birth out of hybrid working, flex hours, flexible schedules. And I think that is what businesses are currently grappling with around managing sustainability of business continuity. But at the same with this juggle of how do we make sure we are able to also be at the forefront of being flexible, but not trading off the inclusive culture that we're trying to build with our teams. So I'm not sure what your view on this is and what your stance is on where you stand as a leader, because there's an element of most organizations indicating everyone just has to come back and let's just start at ground zero, because we all used to come to the office pre-2020. And now there's all these mini elements of I want a contract that's unique to my needs, but I don't want to get to work before 10 o'clock. What is your view on how leaders are able to balance that? I don't know if you have the total answer to it, but just your vantage point. What is your thoughts?
So I think, Cass, this is not a simplistic conversation. I think it is complex, because just with the way in which you phrased the question, you have opened up a conversation from a multi-dimensional perspective. And what I mean by that is you are dealing with complexities of psychological safety. So when I look at myself and I want to have a workplace that suits me, my needs of starting like 10 o'clock in the morning, it's high flexibility, high onus on being accommodating to me as the employee, with a space where I'm being looked after, I'm psychologically being taken care of, and I have the opportunity to fail forward, make mistakes, learn as I go. So that's really great. So from a cultural nuance point of view, employee centricity, employee value proposition perspective, tick. Then you have the other component where you look at the culture of the organization. So how do you create cultural nuances in an organization by making sure Everybody is learning. Everybody has the opportunity to engage. If there is something specific that happens within the office environment that creates a disruption or a stress, that all people can actually engage with it. And that can happen if you're physically present. And then there's the other nuance of workflow requirements, project-related, client-related initiatives, and actually what pays the bills at the end of the day. So I think for me, there's these three very key nuances, and they can be very polarized. They can actually be in competition with each other.
Yeah.
And I think from an employer and employee perspective, that's where, I love the way we always look at on a contract basis like that and say it's mutually beneficial. That's what an employment contract is. It's mutually beneficial. And I think that is important to understand. So for me, my personal take is, if you're working in an environment of high trust, and you're working in an environment where you want the best for your people, natural fluidity of the working environment will be required. Meaning you will be required to some days be at the office and some days not. And some job functionalities, not person, job functionalities, requires you not to be at the office at all, because it's deep independent work and potentially sits with a very specialist role, and those people only need to engage with project specific things. So as leaders, this is quite a complex thing, but I think the biggest challenge we face is inconsistency.
Yeah.
If we are not consistent in the way we approach a policy or a framework, that's where the trust economy gets deteriorated very quickly.
Yeah.
If you're going to ask me around, okay, what's the research say, except for my opinion? So what does the research say? I'm going to say to you, you're going to get exactly the same answer as what I said first. It's polarized. Yeah. Meaning you can take Zoom for argument's sake. Very interesting case study. They've told everybody to come back to the office. They're a tech company.
Yeah.
It sort of doesn't make sense, right? Because they're tech-based. Why is everybody coming back? Twitter is another example, what they call that X.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's X, yes.
Yeah.
So these are all technology-based organizations. And from that perspective, you're sort of going to go, but that doesn't copulate. The reality is they should be able to work independently, not there, but they are high project teams, high blue sky thinking teams, high sprint components. So we've got to find a way of creating a balance so that we are not polarized with individual needs versus business or organizational needs. And that is the sweet spot of where the leader comes into play, where policy has to be influenced by staff as well as the organization, and the implementation of the policy needs to be consistent so that the trust economy still is protected. So I don't believe in one or the other, honestly. I believe in both. I believe sometimes people need to have a sprint and remote work. Hey, remote work could mean sitting at a coffee shop and working. It doesn't necessarily mean working from home. But there's pros and cons to both. So, yeah.
Just to see Mayur joined us. So Mayur, if you want to get ready to get onto camera, that will be really cool. But I think, Lize, the biggest challenge and what I'm experiencing specifically, I also have a bit of a different generational team.
Yes.
What is sort of fast-tracked with new entrants into the world of work is the expectation, because that's what they've become accustomed to knowing, hey, there's this opportunity to be able to work remote and say, oh, I want flexible hours, which traditional way of working and sort of our older generations doesn't understand that there's an 8 to 5, 9 to 5, whatever the job function is, with a lunch hour, with 2 tea breaks, or if that's sort of the traditional work model. And I'm not sure if what's impacting the view on sort of flexible work and remote work is the entitlement element more than what you've highlighted contractually is the mutually beneficial element. Because I think the entitlement part might be what leaders end up grappling with and then going, no, everyone back, because I can't deal with this. So it's one for all. And I think that might be just for some of our younger generations coming into the workforce, being able to understand the element of these employee needs, but then there's also a business that needs to be run. And so how do you navigate that conversation with your leader? But I suppose tonight we're talking more to the leaders around how do you navigate that conversation. Lize, I want to just bridge into, so we're talking about this no one sort of way in which we want to work, or no one answer. How do we then build an inclusive culture if at this stage we are still grappling with all of these various ways in which maybe there's no policy yet in an organization, or maybe we're still trying to be flexible. But then how does Lize on top of that also go, I need to make sure my team is safe, and build an inclusive culture, and maybe they're sitting in different spots of the world, which Mayur, I know your team sits everywhere. So what would be your view on how do we now go about building that culture, knowing that there's still teams that are quite segmented?
Yeah, am I going first before we hand over to Mayur? So I'm going to choose your heart. And what I mean by that is, and I know I always say this to my team, I'm blessed that I always have young adults around me the whole time. And I think that if you choose from an employee perspective as the new generation coming in to be totally independent remote worker, you can choose that. You are going to have to find positions that's going to allow you that. However, the payoff for that is a learning cycle that you are going to enter in when you are learning, when you are working with others. And there's something to be said when you're in a physical space with people, physical team spaces. So I think, and that's what I mean by choose your heart. There's a payoff. So you win some, you lose some. So you've got to figure out, what do you really want to learn? And I think that we underestimate the skills transfer and the applied competence that starts taking place when we engage and work with each other. Now, we also have systems, just like MS Teams, and we're using that as a system or a framework. And I think as leaders, we've got to understand that we've got to start using tools that enable us to be more intentional. To check in with a staff member at the office becomes really easy. Why? Because you can notice body language, you can see something, you can observe it, you can pick it up in the moment. But when your team is totally remote, locally or globally, you don't have that privilege. So you've got to be more intentional when you lead teams like that. And that check-ins that is informal in a physical space really needs to come more into a formal framework as an intentional activity that you actually do to engage your team and to make sure that they also okay. Because remember, we tend to forget about people that's not here, not in our eyesight. And I think that as a leader, that consistency and that integrative communication and that intentionality is what's really important. So for the leader, I'm going to say choose your heart where that's concerned. You've got to understand it takes time to lead a team that's remote. You've got to make the time for it. You've got to make them feel just as important as the person sitting right next to you. And that is intentional leadership. It's a choice. It's a planned activity. And hopefully the more you do it, it becomes a habit so that you don't think about it. So it becomes the unconscious competence as we move forward. But that's my opinion. I'd love to hear what Mayur has also got to say.
So you just have to get your microphone.
Hi guys, how's it going?
Welcome.
Apologies for being late, but you know the lines make it difficult to manage.
On. But welcome. But you're in a multinational, global organization involved with teams in a very dynamic space. So what would be your view on, exactly to Lize's point, around how you've helped your teams navigate this inclusive culture, but also working all over the globe?
Yeah, and look, I think you guys, having worked with you guys, you obviously have a good understanding. Like you rightly say, it's a very, there's an added layer of complexity, I think, when you add that multinational element to it. And I'll break it up into a few parts. I think in terms of the diversity element, sometimes we really forget how far along actually South Africa is in terms of the global understanding of what diversity is. We're a lot further ahead. BEE, depending on which side you fall, actually as a framework has really pushed South Africa and its workforce into a space that drives inclusivity. And our team's a strong advocate of it. And if you look just around our sort of local subsidiary, when you compare it to global standards, it's, chalk and cheese. And it sounds weird. It really does, but in a lot of cases, I would say we're quite far along in terms of maybe having the frameworks to structurally generate those diverse sort of morals and ethics. And then the second part, I think, in terms of now getting your teams, when you have the diverse teams, like what do you do with them? Which in itself, I guess, is something that it presents a challenge that I think, which is uniquely South African. The part, and the one part I'll say is, in our organization, we've got a mix of blue collar and white collar workers as quite a range of people that you're going to deal with. And in some senses, our business can't function without the persons, sort of being at the office physically, representing themselves there and giving of themselves to that task. And in the other sense, the white collar workers, need something a bit more flexible, like when you need to work from home, which I currently negotiated today. You need that space in order to sort of navigate that. And I think our leaders have found a challenge in finding the balance in those two worlds, because essentially, we've got multi-generations also within our diverse team, and then, obviously from different backgrounds, different perspectives, that makes that challenging. But I think the important part is, and then some of the thing that's helped us to move along is really understanding communication styles and what's important to the two groups. And like, Lize says, really finding the middle ground. My boss really likes me to have that face-to-face and, hands on the computer screen to show him which numbers are supposed to be where. But at the same time, he's got to also adapt himself to understanding, like, Teams, Google Meet, these type of things allow you to bridge that gap just in a different way. And he has to find security in that. But it's an ongoing thing, which I think needs to have a process that drives, if you believe in the process, you'll kind of move slowly along to a better end goal. And I think that's kind of where we are as a multinational organization. And you'll find in different regions, like, for example, especially in the EU, they're a lot more flexible to work from home. This sounds a bit shitty, but we recently had like a team that was based in Dubai, which they decided, let's maybe close down that office. And all those teams were then sent, all those people in Dubai were sent back to their home countries. And then they became fully remote. So even that has a layer of complexity. But I do believe, I think, especially in a South African management context, we still have a bit of that old, say, baby boomer, Gen X sort of mentality around needing to be connected face to face. But it's slowly sort of the cogs are turning. On that change.
I think also sometimes what trips us up is the safety in policy, the safety in contracts, the safety in legislation, because that's what we know. So if all else fails, I can go back to this framework, and it's not even then generational. It's just, hey, but your contract says you're office bound 9 to 5. That's what you signed when you started. And forgetting that the world around us has changed. Life has changed. And I think that's sometimes the safety net perhaps leaders use as a crutch, opposed to maybe going to look at how are we able to be flexible within the framework, specifically to our organization and industry, and then obviously cascading it down to various teams. But unfortunately, in a big multinational, changing policy is not going to happen overnight. There's way too many people involved. Maybe in small entrepreneurial businesses, much easier to adapt. And I think I want to just talk about that a little bit around just the legislation components and where you guys feel leaders are able to go back to a framework that is potentially solid, and find a way in which to be more current in where we find ourselves now. Because unfortunately, I think as much as we may be culturally diverse and benchmark well with other countries, our legislative frameworks are very slow. That doesn't change as quickly. So without trying to be non-compliant, because that's not what I'm advocating. But Lize, I don't know what your view is, because obviously you also engage at a very much a private partnership level as well. Not sure if you have some insights to share where that's at from a labor perspective, and the world of work that's shifted.
Listen, I will always have so Lize personally has a very strong opinion that we are really good at policies and policy frameworks, specifically as a country. We have some of the best policies in the world. We do really, however, suck at implementation, and I want to even take that at a more micro level and not just the macro level, and say, even within organizational frameworks, we sometimes are really slow on the uptake with implementing certain policy frameworks, and sometimes the letter of the law gives us some comfort. So when we have this framework and we play in this framework, we feel comfortable. But you know what? Everything that, it's not possible until it is. Am I right? It's like sometimes we've got to stretch certain things and test certain things. And I'm quite in favor of testing certain scenarios, looking at some of the pros and the cons, even if you're doing it with a pilot group or a group of people to test it, to see what's working, what's not working. Because I think that's how we become progressive. That's how we actually have the chance of not buying into the concept that something can't work without trying it. For most of us, we didn't have a choice. COVID happened and we all had to go remote all of a sudden. So I think there's elements of looking at what are the possibilities. But again, I'm going to come back to the policy also can't be a crisis-based policy, because COVID happened and it unlocked a crisis application. So I think we need to understand that. And then we need to move and say, okay, we're no longer in the crisis mode. So if we're not in the crisis mode, what can we take as good lessons for sustainability for moving forward? So get rid of the stuff that really didn't work, but take the stuff that did work and enhance the way we do things. And the reason why I'm saying that is policy didn't change. Labor law didn't change. COID didn't take. Injury on duty. There's a whole list. We can go through a whole list of policies and procedures that is relevant to our country. And obviously, if there's international guests, there's those policies and procedures that is really for all the other countries. So we're not unique. We have them, and it's globally benchmarked. But the reality is that we need to adapt certain things, and we need to have the conversation around certain things to say what works, what doesn't work, and test it. And I think we don't necessarily build proper test cases, and that can just purely be because time is not necessarily there. Yeah. But I do believe a policy and law is a framework, and our job as leaders with our teams are to take that law, take that framework, and build on it. It needs to make sense for us. And I think we mustn't hide behind it. We've got to use it as a tool. And I think sometimes we hide behind it.
So Lisa, if we want to bridge from that conversation around, being able to not use that, I think for many of us in the room, and Mayur specifically, maybe you, and I see you want to like just bounce in there, it might not always be possible to create test cases. So without putting words in your mouth, you can go for it. You can just unmute.
No, sorry. I just wanted to add, like, I mean, your initial question was framed around sort of South Africa and then the
Yeah,
multinational
world.
piece. So, and I think maybe, Lize was very right, is that compliance ended up becoming like this fear-driven framework that everyone, hucks to like make sure that they've ticked all the check boxes 100%. And in a multinational organization, there's added layers because you've got to develop not just for South Africa, you're now got to develop a framework for the globe, rules and legislation for the globe. And it always doesn't fit every country. What governs SA isn't going to govern Nigeria, and you'll see Nigeria kind of sort of go in and make it fit for them, things like that, or Brazil or any one of the different countries. I think, like you rightly say, though, is you do have to have as a management team a way that makes it a way that works for you. I think the one thing I've seen having where compliance is like sort of the top of our priorities is if you're not really fully understanding of what the actual goal of that compliant framework is set out to do, you can't really build something new off it without really having good, deep understanding of really, I could say, not necessarily the line-by-line rules, but the overall idea of what it's trying to govern. And I think sometimes you can fall short because you'll build this thing and come down the line when someone's poking holes, because that's what ends up happening with the auditors coming in and looking at your business. Those holes will end up being bigger risks to you. And I think compliance in its ideology is to try and reduce the risk. And I think when you do build that, you should have the same thing while also trying to facilitate and drive that growth.
That's awesome. And I think it's quite spot on that you said it, because often we get them caught up in the detail and kind of forget the overall intention. And when we ran a session, I think it was like our second session, very dynamic speaker, and you've encountered Inbam on one of the sessions you've attended. Very forward thinking, very different generation, might I add.
Yeah.
And she honed in on that very element around what is the intent really behind this legislation or framework, but then there's also business, and how do we marry these two together to ensure that we're serving the sustainability of the business, but also the well-being of the employee, which is exceptionally critical. And sometimes we trade off, I suppose, the business sustainability elements of, you work here, you're an employee, for that value proposition that actually does become, the generation that also has chosen to work at a certain brand. No longer is it about just, oh, I've got a job. It's actually about either a career or building a long-term sustainable career, especially for some of our younger generations that might be biasly viewed as job hopping for opportunity to opportunity. They're also looking at where's the cultural alignment, the value alignment. Can I help this business grow? And if legislation is the answer to everything, I'm also going to bounce, because then it means that actually this organization is not progressive. They're not challenging the status quo. They're kind of getting bogged up in the detail. And I think that unfairly so is if as leaders we're not, and I think Dion made the comment earlier around being so stuck in our ways and not being open to change and being fearful of change, because leaders feel that they need to have all the answers, which is also not true. And we need to get over ourselves around actually we're all learning here. So Lisa, to you, if I can just kick it back to you quickly, and Mayur, please just bounce in like easily. I want us to just quickly focus on, so we've spoken about like different work modes, different time zones, and sort of that flex element of creating an inclusive culture. But I want us to just pause that sort of businessy section and maybe just quickly move into, so naturally different generations working in an organization currently for at any given time. would you be able to frame for us, in your view, what is the work preferences for those various generations? I suppose that also in itself would be a challenge, because businesses change, but maybe our generations want to still have in-person meetings that could have been a Teams or a text.
So do you want my answer, TikTok's answer, or research answer? Because it's
Definitely
very,
not
very...
the ChatGPT answer. Definitely not that one.
No. So it's very, very interesting. So I know we can make this quite humorous, and we I mean, if you look at some of the TikToks that actually exist out there, and they show the different generations and how they arrive at work and engage in work, it's like it's nice when we can laugh at ourselves a little bit. But I think there's a lot of truth that's sometimes said in jest. And if we align it to research and we align it to culture sets within the generations, Boomer, Generation X, Millennials, Gen Zs, and Alphas that's coming out of the schooling system now, we've got to understand that people arrive differently. And if I can just hone for a moment to use a neutral space. So if I just hone for the moment the generation that was in their high school season within COVID, and how they're coming out of high school into their next season is very, very, very different to any previous generation that we've experienced. And they're asking different questions.
Yeah.
And just going and studying is not necessarily just the natural choice. If you know what I'm saying, we finish school and then the next step is natural. You either go work or you're finding a career path in a study field. And a lot of them are making different decisions or different choices. And an element, so when you look at the research, if you tie those elements and you look at the research, one of the research elements that they keep on saying is that the generation coming out of schooling system now are struggling with components like resilience, stress management. So that links to the feelings of anxiety people are feeling. So what happens is, because they are more anxious, they've got to learn to regulate more effectively. And if they need to learn to regulate, that then means that in the workplace, it's actually presenting itself in a certain way, which means in the workplace, it potentially could represent in the way of, I can't deal with this right now. I need some time to think if I'm able to take on this additional activity. Now, my generation is going to go, pull yourself towards yourself. You need to execute the task that needs to get done. That's your job. Now, if you look at the generational responses in that, I think as leaders, what we need to understand is there's a way in which generations are presenting specifically certain stresses. You need to lead your team through stresses. Leadership's job is to create directionality, not the doing. It's the vision. It's casting the way we're going. So if that's our job, you need to learn to now engage with somebody that is potentially saying, I need a moment, to allow them the moment, although you might not actually agree with it. Does that make sense? Now that's hard for you as a leader, because that's not your natural go-to. Yeah. Your natural go-to is maybe when you have now worked 12 hours, you're exhausted, you sat in traffic for 2, you're getting home and you're telling your spouse how bad your day was. So do we see we deal with stresses differently, and the generations specifically are dealing with stresses differently? So, and Mayur?
Just to jump, I'd like to add, I think on top of it, in a South African context, there's an added layer. Given the youth unemployment we have, which is something that often not considered in the South African narrative. Yes. So, you're right, you very rightly, and we've just had a batch of young learners come through one of our programs, and there's this, they have a deep-seated fear of not having anything afterwards,
Yes.
because it's just so high. The opportunities for them are lacking. Now, I think what is missing, which you're right, is the resilience in the start, especially once they get in, because of the fragility of everything in the background. On top of it, you know, we have the added layer of a lot of those youth coming from previously disadvantaged backgrounds. And they've got pressures at home, which, you know, heighten that situation. So I think they deal with an intensity very difficult to sort of comprehend to some of the older generations that are in our workplace, and I've seen it. So I'm 35. I would be considered kind of like a millennial or youngish type of leader, and try and be the hybrid between those who come from the older side and an understanding on the lower side. But that back to the resilience piece is they have to be taught a bit in something outside of the organization to understand the basic meaning of that resilience and the need and the role they play in helping the business to get to that point. So we were very lucky that the program that we partnered with really helped to teach them that, with very like arduous things of literally every time we've done something, ticking off a task. It sounds basic, but by the end of it, it got them to that space. But I do add that when you add these layers that we have in South Africa to the changing social dynamics of these young kids, it's even trickier, I believe, to find a good middle ground and to find something you can connect with them with. Because I always say this to my team and our management team, our executive team, is don't for 1 second pretend that you know their truth, because you can't have lived it. It's a different kind of stress, a different level of intensity, with its own challenges than what you have. So because people often try and do that, they try and liken a scenario to how they would have dealt with it. You also have the benefit of a lot of hindsight, which is kids do not have.
Oh, that's amazing.
If I may, Cass, I would like to just add, I so agree with you. The complexity of the social economic impact that we have in our country adds layers and layers and layers. On top of that, a high youth unemployment, and just a disillusionment with regard to what life is. And there was very interesting where they did a global case study with regard to the current generation coming into the world of work. And just their ability globally, now I'm saying, not just localized within South Africa, their ability to become independent adults, just from a financial perspective, and how the price point for property, price point for housing, price point for transport has actually increased dramatically, and how people, they actually can't afford to exit their parental homes if we look at it from that perspective. Now, on top of that, that is a generalized global view. Now, you put it on a developing country with 60% youth unemployment and a high unemployment ratio, and it just has such a massive compounding impact. And I think that's also where roles of leaders and also where organizations could do better, is to create opportunity, and I'm going to call it for regulation. And what I mean by that is, as an individual having the opportunity to do self-regulation, because we can't save everybody. We can't fix everybody's circumstances. But what we can do is we can give people tools to allow themselves to learn to regulate, to learn to deal with stresses, to learn to lean into the anxiety, but to regulate that anxiety then. So, and I think that maybe that's where we also can do better, because each of us, from a generation point of view, none of us are perfect. I mean, we all have issues. I mean, your boomers was loyal to the end, and that doesn't mean that was good. Did you ask hard questions when your leader was absolute narcissist from a leadership perspective? No, because loyalty was the thing. So I needed to keep quiet, and I just needed to, that doesn't mean it was right.
Yeah.
So I think if each generation, if we can take learning from each generation and we can be open to the learning, I think that's where leadership has then got the ability to really truly manage multi-generational workforces and multicultural workforces. Because I think it really doesn't matter. When people have polarized views, different ways of approaching things, different way of looking at things, I think our biggest job is to be open to listen, to have empathy. I think that's the other thing. And Mayur, I so agree with you. Don't assume you know. And don't think because you had something happen to you now that makes you relatable. It really doesn't. And I think that is just creating the opportunities. And then the last thing I want to say, I think that's also where it's really important for us from a leadership and from a business perspective, and I think just from an ethical point of view, we've got to become mentors to people. We have to give back. So, I mean, Mayur, you mentioned hindsight. We've got a whole lifetime of a working career. So how do we use what we've learned and sow that back into the younger generations that's coming into the place of work? Because surely we're handing over to the next generation. So what would be interesting is if we actually unpack the word sustainability and we unpack that from a leadership point of view, and we unpack succession. What does that truly mean? Does that not mean as a leader, I'm giving time to somebody else to grow, learn, develop, and be better than what I was as a leader? We've got to leave a legacy, because otherwise, what are we doing? Well, that's how I feel, sorry.
That's awesome. And I think tonight's session, because we're sort of 5 minutes out, this has really been valuable. We've also looked at labeling it, managing or leading multi-generational teams. Because to the point around managing is managing a task and output, and sometimes being quite oblivious to the person delivering the output. I mean, Mayur, you mentioned blue collar, white collar workers. Sometimes even just that in itself, that segregation is blue collar workers task, do as I say, not as I do. And a lot of leaders walk around with that sort of attitude, if I can call it that. But I think the challenge for us in the room tonight is if you are labeling yourself as a leader and not a manager of just tactical output, the question really on the table is, so how are you leading differently? Because that leadership is being quite aware and very present around being able to pick up on the subtle nuances that is not being said. To your point around unemployment, youth unemployment, not knowing people's circumstance, how they get to work. If we say their work time is 8:30, some people are on the road from 4:30 or 5 o'clock to get to work at 8:30, especially if you're living in KZN in South Africa. It's not easy. It's just really not easy. It's afternoon for you when you get to work at 8:30. And for leaders, I think the challenge that we have and the burden we carry is being able to navigate in various modes at any given day, which is quite exhausting, I suppose. But in the same breath, it's rewarding when you see people grow as a result of the effort. So to close us out, I'm going to ask both of you, because you're two leaders from actually two very different generations. So some cleverness in that. But what would be your encouragement based on your sort of tenure in the roles that you've had, to leaders sort of listening to you both tonight going, it sounds great, but I'm in a different reality? What would be some of the encouragement or lessons that you want to just maybe share, 2 or 3 from your own journey? Is what did you do to kind of go, I'm able to manage, or I feel very comfortable managing multi-generational teams? I'm not sure who would like to go first.
I don't mind. That's a hell of a question to try.
I know.
Try and close
I
out
know.
with.
It's a close out. But give it a stab.
Yeah. Look. It's going to sound cheesy, but look, a big piece of the puzzle of understanding yourself which our team was very fortunate to go through with Omni, and really, having a good understanding of your personality traits that brought about. While you maybe knew it inherently, and I think, we kind of said that to the team, you kind of know these things in the background, but you don't necessarily have all the words to put it there. Now, what that does is it lets you unlock, once that information is present, it lets you unlock learning of those things and how to try and improve, maybe address your shortcomings, or lift up more of your strengths, those type of things. So that was one big pivotal moment. And I think for me, the empathy part and always being willing to learn and understand people's backgrounds allows you to then build a connection a lot better, which is when I look at the people I interact with and the people I've maybe as a leader have helped grow, that was two of the biggest parts. And there's a subtlety in knowing how to push people's psyche for certain things. Some people respond differently. When you're young, you don't really know that, but the experience with time, learning something and applying it in terms of practical experience, that was definitely invaluable. So I think, in summary, those three things I would say to any one person: go and try as quickly as you can, get a good grasp of who you are, understand what you are in your everyday, and understand what you are in your overextended ways. And then I would say empathy, couple that with learning, helps you grow. And then being able to understand the subtleties of different types of people.
Beautifully summarized. Thank you. Lize.
I can definitely totally agree with Mayur. I think for me, that growth mindset that you're speaking about is so critical. As a leader, it doesn't matter what your tenure is. And Kaz, I noticed you called me old, so I will not hold that against you.
I don't think I said that word. I'll check the recording.
No, it was implied. It was implied. I think that, the growth mindset, being willing to learn, and what Mayur is mentioning about having that self-reflective view of who you are, how you arrive at work, how you yourself manage stresses, when things aren't going according to plan. I think those are just critical components. I don't think it's something that we're not aware of. We sort of go leadership 101. You need to have understand your leadership identity. But the reality is, the way you were in your 20s versus your 30s versus your 40s, we are growing the whole time. So I think re-looking at these become such important aspects. And then the one last element for me is, I'm going to call it the cascading. And what I mean by cascading is, people watch you the whole time. I don't care who you are and what position you fill. So they watch you. They watch you here. They watch you in the physical space. So be aware. Have that awareness. Have that situational awareness of, people watch your behavior. And they watch not what you say, but your intentions and your actions, because actions do speak louder than words. And I think with that, over the years, I've realized I cannot, Lize personally, cannot necessarily influence or affect every single individual in the organization that I find myself in. But I can have a direct impact on my first tier. So my job is to be very intentional with my tier, and to my tier that's with me, my colleagues, my next line, and in turn be intentional with working with them so that they can be better at working with their people, and trusting them for them to cascade it down to the next level, So I do see it as a little bit of a, if your cup is full, you're pouring out in others. And I think that for me is also a pause point to say, make sure your cup is full, leaders. Make sure you are making time to fill yourself again. And that then comes back, Mayur, to what you said, it's just that growth mindset. It's we influence from there. We don't influence on empty. We only can influence when we are full.
And I think just like one thing that I just thought of while Lize was speaking, which has been very valuable to me. I've been very lucky to have a friend group of all kind of very, leaders in different senses and not maybe all at the same level, but being able to share stories as like a peer review. I wouldn't say call it a peer review. That's been really good. I'm very lucky to have my partner who also in a very, high up leadership position, but understanding maybe different nuances in different spaces and how it works also gives you better empathy and understanding. So I would suggest network, get around, speak to different people, because your problem may not always be just isolated to you. There could be different ways somebody else has solved it.
I think someone in the chat has just mentioned the importance of mentorship. And specifically for building sort of a next generation of leaders, but also as opposed to if you're in a leadership role, exactly to what you're saying is having a soundboard versus going off at your team, is finding a quiet room of, I'm going through this now, give me some advice, or just to like unwind is very important. And you can game face on and go back out. And we all are human. I mean, I don't know if people think if they get into a leadership role that you become superhuman. I think many of us, maybe not all the gents will agree, cry in their cars in they've had a tough day because they can't do it at the office. But I think to the point, just to summarize where we're ending off tonight, I suppose it is around the adaptation for leaders, being able to just adapt into the world of work, being totally self-aware, if I can summarize what you guys have said. Being quite intentional but situational with the situation that you're facing within a team, and then being also very mindful of the cultural nuances within like sort of local social settings, aka South Africa or the country in which you operate, but also just being quite mindful of those differences more so than just age, in this case, ageism, is being able to understand those backgrounds. That's a wrap for us. We're slightly over time, I think about 5 minutes over time, but what a beautiful way in which to end our session. Mayur has alluded to the program he's been on. I popped that into the chat. He's one of our first members of our Disruptive Leadership Program for 2023. So I think really good insights, minus your natural ability to share. So thank you for joining us. I think someone just quickly popped their hand up, or maybe didn't, or it's gone again. But yeah, everyone that's joined us, we appreciate you being part of our community. We will bring you open source training in 2024. Not 100% sure how that looks, but we will in due course communicate that. Have a brilliant afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you find yourself. Thank you so much.
Guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Mayur. Thank you, Kaz.
Awesome.
Guys.
Thank you.
Hey, bye.
Bye.